Good morning, everybody. I know you all accustomed seeing Lisa Lord, and I will attempt to stand in her place. She's unavailable this morning. We have with us today Minister Lisa Cummings, who's the Minister of Energy and Business, Minister Kerry Simmons, who's the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Minister Colin Jordan, who's the Minister of Labor. So, Kerry, over to you.
Thank you very much, Minister Abrams. Ladies and gentlemen of the press, good morning. This particular post-cabinet press conference is going to touch a few issues. I think the first and foremost will be an aspect of Barbados' foreign policy. Then after that, we're going to treat to a couple of other matters, the labor clauses issue, which is obviously of great concern nationally, and of course the inescapable issue of what government continues to do with respect to cost of living. If I can start on the question of foreign policy, I really want to thank the Nation newspaper for raising a matter in its editorial a few days ago, which suggests that we should have more conversation as a country with respect to Barbados's foreign relations. I could not, I could not help but agree with many of the sentiments expressed. And you will recall that it was last year in the estimates that for the first time, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs would have appeared in the well of the House in order to have an extensive discussion on the country's foreign policy. Cabinet would have, during the last two meetings, settled on what we call agrément, which is just the French word for agreement, to an offer or an indication coming from the government of Panama that they wish to deepen their relationship with Barbados still further, and that they have chosen Barbados as the place in the Eastern Caribbean where they will now wish to establish an embassy so that we will have on the ground representation of the government of Panama here in the country. In same measure, the government of Mexico has also signaled to us and asked for Barbados' government to give agreement, and cabinet has agreed to that as well, for them also to establish a mission here in Barbados. Now, I want to just cast your minds back a little bit because there was a period of time when, rather than governments seeking to come here as they are now doing, to establish missions and to deepen the representation on the ground in Barbados, and to use Barbados as a fulcrum through which they reach the Eastern Caribbean, the exact opposite was taking place. Barbados was the place from which people were leaving. And I think that what you have to recognize now is that there is a growing degree of confidence and there's a growing degree of interest in doing business in Barbados and with Barbados. And that is something about which we, as all Barbadians, I hope, would continue to be very proud. With respect to the specifics of both relationships, as you know, the government of Barbados, this particular government, set up a mission in Panama. We had at the back part of our minds that which we always knew but did nothing about for many, many years, and that is that we have a large percentage of the Barbadian diaspora located in Panama. Unfortunately, a lot of these people are now aging, but the reality is we have to build the relationships. There are many people who continue to have an interest in doing business with us and are doing so. There are those who wish to embrace us with respect to matters of cultural development, commercial trade, tourism, the link between ourselves and Panama, touristically speaking, and I myself am a former tourism minister. Minister Cummings is also a former tourism minister. And I think we can both say to you very candidly that the Copa Airlines flight has done tremendous work with respect to our being able to deepen that relationship and benefit from Panamanian tourism and cultural travel, recreational travel, and business travel. Similarly with Mexico, the new foreign minister of Mexico has expressed a very strong interest and a keen desire to deepen the relationship with Barbados. Barbados, for Mexico, has been a point in the Caribbean through which the Mexican government has been able to build relationships of a cooperative and developmental nature, not the least of which is in the agricultural sector. Tremendous work is being done between ourselves and Mexico in that regard. I should say also with respect to Panama, the question of climate change and Barbados's voice in the international community on this matter. I should not say change, I should say crisis. This crisis we have with climate. As you know, the Panama Canal has itself now become challenged in order to maintain its role as being the crossroads of the world, so to speak, again, because of the climate crisis. You have a shortage of water because you have a shortage of rainfall. Because of that shortage of rainfall and water, the Panamanian government is challenged in order to find a way to raise the levels of water so that the Atlantic side can meet the Pacific side and a ship can pass through easily. The amount of times that those locks would have operated traditionally in one day has now substantially decreased. And in October or November of last year, there was actually a backup of ships at the canal, which may have been 70 or so ships long, waiting for their turn to come through. That was entirely unprecedented. But each of those ships is carrying product which is representative of the desire and the demand that the consumers here in the Caribbean have, representative of the desire and the demand that the business people here in the Caribbean have in order to get our goods out of the Caribbean region into the Asian market, or alternatively get our goods from the Asian market to the Caribbean region. And it is obviously a knock-on effect which is felt by our people in this perennial way on the matter of cost of living, which Minister Cummings will also speak to during the course of today. So that the voice that our leader has, the voice that our government has, and the level of recognition for intellectual thought leadership on this matter of the fight against the changing climate is one of the reasons why both Mexico and Panama have signaled their interest in deepening the relationship with Barbados, because, quite frankly, we are in a very small way, and I say this very humbly, now position ourselves as being thought leaders to the world. And this is something, again, about which I hope the people of Barbados will recognize that there is a need to be supportive. So that covers basically the decisions of the cabinet with respect to the foreign policy initiatives to have these two missions located here. There is a third, and that has been signaled to me by the government of Colombia. They too have expressed their interest. They already have a mission in Trinidad and Tobago. So the real issue now that we have to settle is, will they have an entirely new mission headed by an ambassador here, or will this be a split, so to speak, of the representation? Of course, that is a political and economic consideration for the government of Colombia. Once they have settled that, then we will know the extent to which the representation here will either match that in Trinidad or be shared with Trinidad. But the reality is that, yet again, it is an expression of interest and confidence by another Latin American country for deepening the relationship with Barbados. I am not going to go into our relationship with the Middle East at this point, because there are a few things that I want to say to the country, but today is not the day for that. But I will have, at a more dedicated opportunity, a chance to speak with you all about Barbados' relationship with the Middle East. Minister Abrams, I don't think there's anything else I could usefully add on these matters.
Good morning, Minister Simmons. Hi, Sharika Griffith from CBC. If you could say, what would you say would be the benefits to the average Barbadian of these two new missions?
Oh, most certainly. I think the first thing is trade, products. I want us to understand that we have, through the years, bought in heavily to the ideal, and perhaps just the idea, that if it doesn't come from the North Atlantic, it isn't good. It is not a good idea, and it's certainly not the ideal way of looking at things. I think that what we have been able to do is to build up trade relationships with CARICOM, first of all, and I think by now we can be satisfied that we get a lot of good quality commodities from the CARICOM community. They are cheaper in many regards, as in less expensive. They are less expensive in many ways than those similar commodities or products which we will source from outside of CARICOM. As a further extension, the same principle is applying to, let us say, Latin America. And because of the fact that you are having less freight time, because of the fact that you probably have a less expensive form of production, et cetera, the access to these commodities and the quality of the commodities is also very good. And so therefore, when we are faced, as we now are, with the ongoing challenge of the cost of living, it is sometimes useful to find new ways of getting new products onto the shelves of Barbadian people and Barbadian supermarkets, etc. And it is also important for our people to have the power of choice so that you can get a product of similar or equal quality, and in some cases maybe even better quality than that which you have obtained from the North Atlantic, but at greater prices. It is part of the need for our country to look at the way in which we spend and what we spend on and how we go about budgeting. And I think that what the government has to do is to provide you with options wherever possible, work with the private sector to make sure that there are new product lines. And that is basically where I think the deepened relationship with Latin America is going to become very, very useful for Barbados. Just to share with you, cast your mind back about what you already know. Venezuela, for example, in September last year, would have signaled to us that they wanted to open their market for our investment in agricultural product. We signaled to Venezuela what we need to grow. And because we don't have as much land space here, they will give us, I can't remember how many thousand acres it was, but make the acres available to us so that we can begin to do our own thing. Similarly, we have that type of relationship with Guyana. We have that type of relationship with Suriname. And as we build out that network, we make it easier for this country to have food security. And by extension, it makes it easier for our people then who are in business to start to do more with the business opportunity, including exporting of some of their product.
Minister, apart from the new foreign policy initiatives that you would have mentioned this morning, there were others that you would have mentioned in the past. For example, you just touched on it on the bilateral agreement with Venezuela on the use of land. Could you give me an idea as to, because the whole idea is for these things to actually materialize. Could you give me an idea as to the kind of take up that we are seeing, or I mean, what's the stage of advancement with some of these initiatives that would have been announced maybe since last year before?
No, not year before. Don't do that to me. It was done in September or October of last year. And in the succeeding 4 or 5 months, I know for sure that a part of it touched the Ministry of Energy and the willingness of the Venezuelan government to collaborate with us on energy. And a mission from the Ministry of Energy went to Venezuela, and I think twice. Yes. One was led by the lady sitting right next to me, and a technical one thereafter. Work happening in the interest of the people of Barbados, not loitering on the steps of government. Similarly with agriculture, a technical mission went down to Venezuela, I think on 2 occasions as well, one led by the Minister of Agriculture, then another of the technical people, looking at the land that was allocated for purposes of suitability for certain crops, connectivity by road so that you can move those crops, and then also looking at the sanitary and phytosanitary regulations, technical language, but simply meaning making sure that the quality and safety of the food that you are growing is such that you can move it from one country to another without having to worry about pests and other types of agriculture-related diseases. So that the work behind the scenes has begun and is ongoing. And it has been done within the last 4 months.
All right, I stand corrected, sir.
Morning, everybody. I think perhaps it's important that we do have this conversation immediately after the presentation just made by my colleague, Senior Minister Simmons, who is responsible for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade, but he's also the Senior Minister for all of the productive sectors. And so whether it is energy, commerce and business, agriculture, our industry, he does have, and tourism, he does have oversight over the operations of all of those various line ministries and how they're all fit together neatly. So let me start by positioning that my comments by within that context. So Senior Minister was just asked a question specifically of around how the establishment of new diplomatic missions here in Barbados and how do those things benefit the average Barbadian. What I can tell you is that from the Ministry of Commerce's perspective, we have been doing an analysis of prices. We have been looking at specific products. We have been analyzing the basket of goods that are of interest to Barbadians and tracking the prices. What we have undertaken to do on a monthly basis and on a bi-weekly basis is to look at what those trends are. Are they going up? Are they remaining level or are they coming down? What I can say to you is that even in the face of what we have seen is increasing freight rates, we've seen, for example, out of the Middle East, specifically using the Red Sea, we've heard about the challenges in the Red Sea. We've seen a 248% increase in shipping prices from that region. In the United States, we saw a massive increase in shipping during the course of the COVID period. While those prices are coming down, they remain above 2019, 2020 levels. What that has meant is that the products that we are importing into Barbados from the markets that we are familiar with remain challenged in terms of price volatility. The opportunity, therefore, for Barbados to partner with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade in the establishment of overseas missions means that it looks at helping us diversify our source markets for products that are of interest to Barbadians. So, for example, I can say to you that if I were to take a minute, and I'm going to just do that now for your benefit, to go through the prices, we can see, for example, that during the period that we reviewed prices, items like sliced ham, peanut butter, corn flakes, apples, oranges, those prices were below the compact prices that would have been negotiated at the time by my predecessor, who would have been Senior Minister Simmons. And those prices continue to trend below what the compact prices were. In every product, what we have seen is that the prices negotiated during the compact, those prices across the retail sector have held, which is a clear indication that the government's intervention by working with the private sector to cap markups at a given level across various products in the basket of goods, the 47 items that are being monitored, those prices have held. And we have ensured that we can work with the private sector in the interest of Barbadians to, one, keep prices even outside of a compact where we can control them in as much as we can control them, because let me be clear, we have no control over freight prices. Senior Minister Simmons has spoken about the Panama Canal. In the Panama Canal, we have seen the introduction of a Panama Canal service charge, which adds a further close to just under $300 per container coming through the $300 USD, this is, coming through the Panama Canal. We've seen a further charge of around $1,200 per container by one particular shipping line. So those charges are not things that the government of Barbados has any control over. But that notwithstanding, we have continued to work very closely with the Bridgetown Port. As you've seen the reduction in the container charges. We've seen them reducing it by 10% and then by a further 7.5% now, which is the level that it is at. That constitutes a percentage of the overall cost, and so it matters to the consumer how we're able, even if in incremental stages, to cap prices or to introduce measures which will dampen the impact of external factors on the prices that are paid to I should say the prices that are charged to Barbadians. And I want to take the opportunity to thank the private sector, despite some challenges, for always being willing to come to the table. And they have, and I believe I heard the immediate past president of the Chamber of Commerce speaking earlier this week. And he spoke in the public space about a meeting that took place in a private space. And so I want to take the opportunity to thank him for his willingness at all times to engage with us. But yes, they have placed on the table in that meeting some further recommendations on how, together with the private sector, we can consider making further interventions into the market. And I can give the commitment that under the Ministry, Department of Commerce, we will be developing a paper in collaboration with the private sector and looking at how we can further make any further interventions into the market where applicable to ensure that we do what is necessary to protect the interests of consumers. I'll say that, and then the final thing that I will say, however, is that I don't want to give the impression that we have full control over prices, which we do not. All of the factors are not within our control. But this government and the compact and the post-compact period, they have all demonstrated a commitment by this administration to do that which is necessary and that which is within its control to ensure that we protect the interests of consumers. We've seen countries all around the world. Every country has been complaining about increasing prices. These are not factors that are impacting Barbados alone. But what we have seen is that the Barbados government, this administration, where possible, where within our control, we have not been afraid to act. We have not hesitated to intervene, and even at the expense in some instances of government revenue, we have ensured that we have intervened in the interest of consumers at all times. And I want that message to be made clear. I don't know if Senior Minister Simmons wants to add anything from his perspective.
No, well, only to say to you that I think there's a little bit of need to be very specific about that compact and the relationship to prices now. When that compact was negotiated,
July 2022.
July 2022. So we are now into February 2024. We intervened, government intervened by bringing the private sector to the table. And just to refresh your memory, we asked them to hold their markups in place. There were some people having a markup of 20 and 25% on some of the products. And we said that is unreasonable. And we asked you to hold the markup in place in the interest of the wider consumer public of Barbados. The next thing then that we did was to identify a basket of goods, 47 items, which the supermarket operators and owners indicated were the highest quantity of purchases, yes, volume, so that by way of looking at the volume, we knew what people were seeking. And we recognized that, look, many of those things are in fact essential items. You have your proteins, which were the chicken and the beef and so on and so forth. You had your fruits and vegetables, and then you had some of the other essentials, which were very basics. And I believe that they may have included things like deodorants and so on and so forth, sanitary products, etc. And the statistical evidence that the Ministry of Commerce is now making available indicates that today, all those months after, those prices continue to be on or about where the compact prices were or actually below. And so therefore, I think it indicates two things. One, the usefulness of the government's intervention as we did at that time. And secondly, the continued general good faith of the private sector in this regard.
Yes.
And as the Prime Minister has always said, we're all in this together. And you know, it takes many hands to make a load lighter. And I think that there's evidence now to show that that is what is happening. And so I do not know what other questions you have for me, but that is the positive feedback that we have for you.
Yep. I can give you an example, for your benefit. Rice. Barbadians eat a lot of rice. And we have been, through the compact, able to shield the average Barbadian from the full pass-through effect of the global increases in these prices. We've seen that Barbados, as a result of the measures introduced and the good faith of the private sector in holding our confidence as it relates to the markups, that the prices of rice in Barbados remain below the global average for rice sold across the world. And so we are navigating a range of factors. And so whether it is eggs, tuna products, sardines, the sanitary products to which Senior Minister referred, what we're seeing is that in 2024, February, our prices have held at the compact level as at July 2022 across the board for most of the products, with a few exceptions, which we think perhaps is an overwhelming endorsement of the intervention of the government of Barbados from July 22 until now. And even though we have not had the compact in place, the private sector has still held faith with us on the compact pricing and on the markups.
No, can I just say one last thing? Because I know the country I live in, and I know that it is very, very fashionable and sometimes almost instinctive to go after the government. And this particular member of the government, don't mind, my shoulder is broad. But I can say to you, in all honesty, that I anticipate that I will be told that at X supermarket, the prices are higher today than it would have been in sometime during the period of time of the compact
Yes.
on one product. And what I'm saying to you is that this this information we are sharing is looking at the totality of the supermarkets outlets involved and looking at the range of products. And we feel satisfied that there has been this consistency of the pricing. Now, it doesn't mean that you won't find an exception here and there.
Yeah.
What is important for government to now do is to again intervene and to make sure that there's available to the public the information as to where you might find, let's say, chicken, for example, at a price point that is perhaps lower than where you might be seeing it where you're accustomed going. So that the consumer has that power of having in his or her hand the choice of saying, look, if I go to supermarket A, I can get what I'm looking for at X amount of dollars, whereas if I go to supermarket B, I can pay X dollars and 50 cents more. Is it worth my while to take that extra drive to go to supermarket A, or is it not worth my while? There are some people who will say yes because that is what they want to do. There are some people who will not. But the point is, we have to again try to find a way to help the consumer in that regard, and we will be publishing the information which is available to the Ministry of Commerce and being refreshed by the Ministry of Commerce. How frequently?
On a monthly basis.
On every month. I would love for us to come to a point where we can do it by way of using the technology and have it on an app and make the app available to people in Barbados who want to do that type of research and say, look, if I go to X supermarket, I can get whatever I'm looking for at a point which is more competitive. And perhaps that day will soon come. It does cost a little bit of money and take a little effort to get there, but that is where our mindset is at this particular point in time.
What I would also, though, just want to place in context, one of the things that we began to consider in the updating of the analysis, because if you recall, the initial prices analysis only looked at prices on products in a basket of goods during the compact and across the country. We have also been comparing items within the basket of goods as well as those that are of interest because they're highly consumed by the public. So we've been looking at what the price movements on those have been. What we as the ministry with responsibility not just for consumer affairs but also for business intend to do is to work with the private sector to look at our procurement methods, to look at our logistical arrangements, but also to look at the markets from which we procure goods. There are some companies in the private sector, for example, who will import 30, 40, 20 containers a week, and so they're buying in bulk. And then you will have some smaller operators, for example, who are buying from the importers. And you expect that you're going to have some divergence in pricing as a result of those. That, for example, if you go in any of the bulk, the wholesale stores, you're going to get, because you're buying in larger quantities, a lower price than if you go into the retail operations. And so what we have done is to bring all of the parties together to be able to make sure we can put measures in place that ensure that businesses are able to look at their procurement and their logistic arrangements, and on the other hand, that consumers benefit from the kind of coordination that is going to be necessary on the business side. So we're trying to be as holistic and as comprehensive as possible in the interest of all of Barbadians, all of Barbados.
Taking into account the statistics which answered one of the questions I I had in mind, and also factoring that obviously government cannot be asked to mitigate the tidal wave of cost of living that is pretty much a global phenomenon. We recently still though had update from the central bank governor showing significant growth in Barbados. However, we had that being questioned by some sectors of the public, given the fact that in their view did not translate to the cost of living and that they were experiencing at the point in time. Is it a case that we need to now have a conversation about spending patterns, procurement? What exactly is left that can be done at this point?
Well, Colville, I have long said, since I was sitting in the chair as Minister of Commerce, that we did have to have a conversation about our spending patterns. In fact, I believe that I did an interview with CBC during the month of January of this year, where I reiterated that position. And I can refresh your memory even further. I was called everything other than the name that my mother gave me in a church. Because I said that Barbadians have to be prepared to look at the way in which we spend. And there are a lot of things that we do have some control over. The selectivity of what we purchase and where we purchase it from is in fact one of those things. The private sector has, as Minister Cummins has said, to look at diversification of their lines and so as to give us more options. That is where the Latin American market becomes very useful, especially for fruits, especially for all of the agricultural related commodities. So let us just broadly say food and beverage, juices, etc. It's not just the meats and so on, but we can get a lot of very good quality out of neighboring countries. Do we do enough of that? I think the answer is no. Equally, the cost of living doesn't begin and end in the supermarket. It is also a reality of what we see on our streets. And you have to make choices. I have a friend who tells me that he will go to a rifle range, believe it or not, and spend about $200 on a box of ammunition to practice shooting. But that same friend will tell me that the cost of gas at the pump is too high. I don't want to say to him that he should not shoot because that is his choice. I perhaps may choose to run about on a playing field, but we all have our preferences. But having said that, what we do have is a control over those things that we do and do more of or do less of. I have suggested to this country, and it has chosen not to listen at all, to the view that there is a need for us to do a little bit of carpooling in Barbados. I continue to give the example, which is true as recently as this morning, I have no doubt, that there are 4 or 5 people who live in the area where I live whose children go to the same school. And every one of them go down every morning in a different motor car and come back up every evening in a different motor car. We know these things to be true. We leave home and go to the same church as our neighbors, but we go to the same church in 2 separate vehicles. And the question then becomes, what do we do as a community of people to work together collaboratively in order to try to ease some of the pressures that we know we're all under? It cannot be for the government to intervene. But government has intervened very often. We intervened to cap the prices at the pump for diesel and gasoline. We then intervened again in the households or domestic electricity bills up to a certain 7.5%. We intervened at the port in order to make sure that the cost of freight was kept down to what it was before 2019. The interventions go on and on, but government cannot possibly, as Minister Cummins said, it comes to a point where you do this at a point where you forego governmental revenue, and the same governmental revenue is necessary to sustain some of those things that are fundamental to our way of life, our education, the health care, the maintenance and repair of our roads, a lot of which we are seeing happening now, and on and on. So that there is a role for the whole society to play in this matter of cost of living.
Minister Cummins, since you mentioned the comments made by the immediate past president of the BCCI, I wondered if you care to respond to the other comment he made that the reduction in container charges wouldn't necessarily translate to any major savings for consumers.
So this is a point which was raised, yes, in the meeting. We did do a simulation of how the costs were stacked in terms of landed prices. So we did a comprehensive analysis of, started to look at first cost. So in the first place, if I'm buying a good from China and the price is at the same level that it has been since July 2022 or prior to 2019, then that's your first cost. If, however, that price has gone up, the price at which you're buying it in the first instance, before you even get it on a ship, will begin to be your base price. Then we started to look at the freight pricing. And what we saw, and I already outlined, the freight pricing could go up or it could be coming down, but still higher than 2019 level. that's the next layer of your cost. By the time that product lands in Barbados, you have either a free out port where you have the cost captured in a particular way, inclusive of the duty, or alternatively, you have the cost insurance and the freight pricing. Then you have the port charges. And so the combination of those things are all external. Barbados has no control over, as I said before, the first costs. We have no control over the freight costs. We also have no control over what is charged when the product is landed by the shipping lines. But we do have control over the prices that are charged by the port, which is owned by the government of Barbados. We do have control in terms of engaging with the private sector and agreeing on a willingness to cap the markups. So it has been on that basis that where we have had the control, we have intervened. And that 10% versus down to 7.5%, we have taken the loss. Now let us put this in context. The Bridgetown port will say to you that it means that that is a reduction. And Senior Minister Simmons is speaking about government being willing to forego revenue that will then have implications for the things that are important to us as Barbadians, right? We want to be able to drive on roads that don't take out our shocks, but we need to have the money to do that. We want to be able to have access to education, and this government is the one that reintroduced tertiary level access to education at the University of West Indies. We want to be able to pay for that. We want to be able to pay to go into a healthcare institution and have the response times and have access to the procedures that we require. Those are the things that government revenues go towards. We want to make sure that we support employment. We want to make sure we have access to that. Equally, in the Bridgetown port, we want to make sure that we have access to facilities for employees, for workers, and we also want to make sure that the 90% of goods that are imported into this country are able to pass through having access to infrastructure. So us as a government making the determination to reduce port charges means that the port itself as a commercial state-owned enterprise is also foregoing revenue that is going to be important for them to invest in straddle carriers, to invest in cranes, to invest in the expansion of the cargo berth to allow for more cargo ships to come into the country. So those are the sacrifices that a government inclusive of entities at the Bridgetown port has made, and we are committed to continuing to make those interventions.
Good morning, everybody. There's been in the public space in the last few days some discussion on the labor clauses concessions bill, which is now before Parliament, which we laid on Tuesday. It is, I have mixed emotions in speaking to you about this matter. And those mixed emotions come from the fact that a labor clauses bill is really a bill that seeks to protect workers and to say to employers, there must be a level below which you should not go in order to earn your profits. Some basic level. Now, labor clauses and the idea behind labor clauses is not new either to the world or to Barbados. In 1949, before any of us in here were born, the International Labour Organization at its annual conference adopted a convention, Convention 94, on labor clauses in public contracts. That was in 1949. A previous iteration of government thought it back then in the early 1950s necessary to enshrine that in national law. And so in 1952, the Labor Clauses Public Contracts Act was passed. Now, there are some who suggest, or who seem to suggest, that the idea of labor clauses is new. The idea of labor clauses in our national law goes back to 1952, over 70 years ago. And so the philosophy behind that speaks to businesses that employ people that benefit from government expenditure. In other words, taxpayers' money. The understanding is, and we hold firmly as a Labour Party, as the original Labour Party in this country, we hold firmly to the view, a view espoused by our founder, the late Right Excellent Grantley Herbert Adams, who also founded a trade union. So that is how deep our respect for the whole matter of workers' rights goes. We hold to the view that if a business that employs people is benefiting from taxpayers' money, then their profits, and even before we get to profits, their revenue cannot be at the expense of their employees. It cannot be at the expense of those who work for them. So we've had the public contracts, the Labor Clauses Public Contracts Act in place since 1952. That legislation is what we call framework legislation. Framework from the perspective that it does not bind anybody to do anything, but it allows the chief labor officer, in consultation with employer representatives, in consultation with worker representatives, to set rates of pay, to set conditions of work below which any business or any entity that is benefiting from taxpayers' dollars with respect to contracts should not go. So it essentially sets a floor for the workers of this country. And it sets that floor in the context of the fact that those same workers, it is their taxpayers' dollars. They may not be paying income tax, but they buy things in today's world that attract VAT. Those workers whose taxpayers' dollars are being used to the benefit of the employers, the businesses, should be treated at a level that does not go below some minimum, some set minimum. That minimum is established through consultation between the Office of the Chief Labor Officer, representatives of employers, businesses, and representatives of workers. In 1949, that convention was adopted by the International Labour Conference. But the International Labour Conference also adopted a resolution, Resolution 84, which also speaks to labor clauses. But that resolution foresaw that benefit from public expenditure will go beyond public contracts. And so that resolution includes subsidies and utilities. It understood that the benefit is not just when government is procuring something. It is not just government saying, I want you to build a building. I want you to build a road. I want you to construct something that we can see. It is not just we want to buy rice and potatoes for the school meals department. Benefit from government expenditure also includes subsidies that are given to organizations. Subsidies are given to businesses in this country. But what has happened over time is that rather than government collect money and hand over as subsidies, economic activity and the economic governance, how ministries of finance work, how central banks work, has evolved to say, well, rather than you pay me taxes and I give you a subsidy, you hold the taxes that you would ordinarily give to government, pay over to government, you hold those. That's called tax concessions. So it is a subsidy in a more manageable form of governance. Rather than you pay me, I pay you back, but you remit and I give you back, you hold. Those are called concessions. And so we've realized that as we develop as a country, there is need to make sure that our legislative framework, our laws, how we govern and manage, presents not just for those businesses that are the beneficiary of public contracts, but for those who receive concessions as well, that we have a system that provides for them to meet some minimum standard in the treatment of those who work for them. Last year, in a conciliation session that I conducted in the construction sector, and I do these from time to time. Many times the public is not aware of the conciliations that we do because they do not publicize, because talks are broken down between workers and employers. Is not really for me to put that in the public domain immediately. But we had a situation in the construction sector where a matter came to my attention. And one of the things that came out of this discussion was that in the construction sector, there are employers who, in order to win contracts, particularly government contracts, rather than treat their workers as the employees that they are, refer to them as subcontractors. So you have a mason or a steel bender who is told to come to work for 8 o'clock or 7:30, who is told exactly what to do, the time by which it is to be done, given all the tools with which to do the work. In other words, fulfilling all the requirements to be considered an employee. Some of our construction companies are treating to those workers as subcontractors. Now, what happens when that approach is taken is that the construction company has no responsibility for the national insurance. And we have a lot of Barbadians in this country who will reach retirement age, who will reach pensionable age, and will find out that there is no coverage for them. This government and this party in government is not about that. We are not accepting that, particularly as it relates to taxpayers' money. You cannot benefit from taxpayers' money and then put those taxpayers out to pasture when they really need the protection. And so last year, 2023, we established, after consultation between government through the Office of the Chief Labor Officer, the Barbados Employers Confederation, representing employers, and the Barbados Workers Union, representing workers in the construction sector, met, consulted, and I spoke to Parliament and to the country, and we established rates of pay and conditions of work for persons in the construction, and it really extends to road building as well. I start with that to say to you that the idea of labor clauses is not new. So while 3 consecutive front pages speak to the matter as though it is something new, it is not. And if we're going to be very honest about the discussion, we have to recognize that we're not talking about a new concept, one, but we're also talking about protecting workers. And a country and a government, and I feel very strongly and passionately about this, a country, if it is to be considered a good country or a good government, has to be one that protects those who are vulnerable. There's no need to protect millionaires. There's no need to protect those who can hire lawyers and pursue people. There is need to protect those who are at the bottom of the economic ladder. Let me not say socio, because socio conjures up some other things, including right thinking. And some of those who may be at the bottom economically may be way up sociologically. But anyway, that's a different discussion. So this idea of labor clauses is not new. And it speaks essentially to protecting the workers of this country. Now, coming out of the labor clauses, public contracts work to set rates, because remember that we had legislation from 1952 framework legislation. But as far as our research goes, no rates or terms and conditions of work have ever been set using that 1952 legislation. We have come to the place in Barbados where, and as we did the national insurance revitalization, we realized that there are people outside the net who are going to suffer later. They could include some of our parents and grandparents who will suffer down the road if we do not put systems in place to allow them to be appropriately covered by Social Security. And so, since that was happening in the construction sector, we establish rates, minimum rates, and we establish conditions of work that had to be adhered to if a construction company is going to benefit from taxpayers' money. We started discussions in September last year with the tourism sector, with the Barbados Hotel and Tourism Association, and with the Barbados Workers Union, because we sensed that there were some issues in the sector. In the course of the discussions, we recognized that there was also a need, not just in relation to tourism, but there was a need to make sure we had framework legislation in place that went beyond the matter of public contracts, that included persons who benefited from taxpayers' money foregone. That same money that is needed to fix roads in St. Peter, that same money is foregone to allow businesses to be more competitive. That, like public contracts, cannot be at the expense of the workers. And we are of the view that there must be a minimum standard of pay, a minimum standard of a minimum set of conditions that must be met if businesses are to benefit from taxpayers' dollars foregone, subsidies, concessions. And so we raised that matter in the discussion with the tourism sector, and we shared with them that that was a direction that we were going in to establish this framework legislation. We consulted, because it is framework legislation, it is not sector-specific legislation, it is framework legislation. You then set rates based on sectors, but the legislation is framework legislation. We consulted with the Barbados Employers Confederation. They consulted more broadly. I got the impression that they consulted both domestically, broadly, but also regionally, is the information that I have. We also consulted with the Barbados Workers Union, and we prepared a draft bill. That bill was approved by Cabinet, and we were able to lay the bill in Parliament on Tuesday of this week. And that bill is the Labour Clauses Concessions Bill. That bill seeks to do precisely what the Labour Clauses Public Contracts Act does. The only difference is that the interaction between government and the entity has to do with concessions or benefits that are similar to concessions and subsidies, as opposed to contracts for procurement of goods or services. But it is precisely the same. I should say to you that in the setting of rates, like with the Public Contracts Act, there is to be consultation. Once there are no already established rates and conditions of work, there is to be consultation that is embedded in the Act. Those consultations are to be with employers and workers' representatives. So when we're going to set rates, there has to be that consultation. If there is disagreement in terms of what rates and conditions are to be set, this bill actually goes further than the Public Contracts Act at that point to say if there's a dispute, then we can refer that to the Employment Rights Tribunal in relation to rates or conditions. So there's that precaution there, that appeal system. If there is, when we get now to the point of the revoking or the suspending of any concessions, because that will only happen obviously with reporting, with investigation, with discussion. Revoking concession is not something that any government will do in any willy-nilly manner. But that said, if after all attempts to have compliance with these minimum standards fail, then the minister responsible for the concession, and just let's remember that concessions are discretionary, most concessions are discretionary. In other words, you don't open a business and have a right to a concession. A concession is granted by government through some piece of legislation, and there is a minister responsible. If there's a dispute over the suspension or revocation of a concession, then there is provision in the bill for an appeal, since this relates now to government revenue, to the Barbados Revenue Authority Appeal Tribunal. So there is that provision for appeal if an entity believes that it is unfairly treated with respect to the suspension or revocation of a concession. There is always the Administrative Justice Act, where any business, any person in the country can, that has a mechanism that can be used if you feel that you've been unfairly treated. But I want to maybe just end there and reiterate that this is not new ground philosophically. It is new only insofar as to the point where we are now including in the framework legislation businesses that receive concessions from government, because government forgoes millions of dollars in tax revenue every year. It is now comparable to government procurement. Now, this was not the case in 1952. In 1952, it was procurement. We are now at the point where concessions, the revenue foregone is significant in terms of the tens of millions of dollars, taxpayers' dollars, that maybe could be used to do other things. Foregone. So we have to make sure that the workers in this country are protected. Businesses have the right to make money. And we are all about businesses making money. We want businesses to be profitable. Government cannot employ everybody. It is the private sector that does a lot of employing. And we want private sector organizations and third sector organizations to be profitable. We want them to expand. We want them to increase the number of people they employ. All we are asking is that profitability, that expansion, that growth is not at the expense of workers. We have said for a number of years now since we were in office, we share the burdens, we also need to share the bounty. But the framework legislation does not call for a sharing of any bounty. It doesn't call, for example, that it's never going to say that some kind of incentives need to be paid to workers, that bonuses need to be paid. It doesn't go that far. If you look back to what we did for public contracts, we're just saying that rates of pay need to be fair. And when we did the public contracts, when we set those rates, we did not use the rates of the highest peers. We recognize that there are a few hundred contractors in this country, and they're at different levels of robustness, if I may put it that way. You know, they have different balance sheets, different income statements. And so the rates that we set, the rates of pay, were not some upper level. We set something that we believe all businesses in the sector could afford. And that is our position. As a government, we have been fair. We'll continue to be fair. And we are interested as a Labour Party in protecting the ordinary workers of this country. And as long as we're the government, as long as we lead in this country, we will put a premium on protecting the workers of this country, not at the expense of the country, not at the expense of businesses, but they have to be treated fairly. And that is our commitment to this country and to the people of Barbados.
Okay, thank you. Any questions? Anybody else? Go ahead, Cole.
Minister, you mentioned, well, you gave us a genesis of how the legislation came to bear. Starting from the germination with the construction sector and moving on with the
It didn't start with
dispute.
construction. It started in 1952.
I know, but I'm talking about in recent this
Okay.
recent iteration of it, basically, and also the discussions you had with the BHTA, the BEC, and the Barbados Workers Union. However, there are some who believe that consultation should have gone much wider for a bill of this magnitude. At least it should have been discussed at the level of the social partnership. What would you, I mean, does that point have any merit? Should it have been discussed much wider before bringing this to Parliament?
The bill, Colville, does not break any new ground. This is a philosophy upon which the country has been operating since 1952. We have not broken any new ground. The recommendation, I think I said resolution earlier. The recommendation, when I said number 84, so that was a misspeak. There are conventions and there are recommendations. Recommendation 84 is from back then. So we're not, when I say back then, I mean the time period, but I'm also referring to the fact that subsidies was spoken about back in the late 1940s, early 1950s. So we have not broken any new ground. The consultation beyond what we have done with the Barbados Private Sector Association and the Barbados Workers Union will take place when we have to go to a particular sector. Then the sector representatives will need to be at the table. But we have consulted with the Barbados Employers Confederation, a subset of the BPSA, and they consulted with the BPSA, their parent organization. So, the social partnership, we had consultation with the arms of the social partnership. It was not done in a social partnership meeting, but the consultation was done. And out of that consultation, it was essentially to speak to something that is already in our philosophical groundings. But we did consult. We did consult. As a matter of fact, up to Monday. It was Monday? I don't know if it was Monday. But anyway, we met very, very recently, within the last week and a half, with the Barbados Private Sector Association and the Barbados Employers Confederation. And we actually made 2 adjustments to the bill, to the draft bill, before we approved it as a cabinet and then laid it in Parliament. So there's been consultation. And there have been amendments to the bill, to the draft bill, based on the consultation.
So there have been amendments already.
The bill that has been approved by cabinet and laid in Parliament, the one that you should have used before you went about printing all the stuff that you did, that bill, no, I feel passionate about this, because this speaks to workers. This speaks to protecting workers. So when you hear me sounding strong on this, it's because I feel very passionately about it. That bill has benefited from consultation. This government doesn't talk to partners and then ignore what the partners say. We have never practiced that. We made amendments even before the last meeting, where we made 2 additional amendments. We had made amendments before, based on our interaction and dialogue, which I chaired with the BEC. I chaired that meeting with the BEC. We made amendments based on that discussion.
Amendments to the draft.
To the draft, made based on that discussion. we made amendments based on input from the Barbados Workers Union. We made further amendments when we met again with the BEC and the Barbados Private Sector Association. And so we have the bill that is now before Parliament has benefited from consultation.
So it is safe. Is it safe to say that having had those discussions as recently as Monday, that some of the amendments that have been made and suggested, did you get the sense that there is some appeasement from the private sector as to the concerns? Some of their fears have been allayed.
Colville, I don't even know how to answer that anymore, because what I am seeing in the press, I'm not sure exactly what it's based on. And that's the reason why I made the quip that the bill that should have been discussed in people's meetings was the bill that we laid in Parliament. I'm not sure how you could publish a whole lot of stories about a draft that we asked for comment on when there was a bill laid in Parliament. The bill was laid on Tuesday, right? The first front page was on Wednesday. We laid a bill on Tuesday before you went to press. Now, the fears, from what I get from the media, seem to have been based on a draft that we sent out for comment. Now, we do our, because that's what you have to do. You ask for comment. You don't send out a perfect bill. Even though perfection is in the realm of the divine, if we had a perfect bill, we wouldn't send it out. There'd be no need to. I mean, this is just common sense. If it is perfect, you don't need to ask anybody any questions. You send a bill out because you have done a draft and you want to know how people feel about it. Now, we do our discussion, our consultations with people. We don't do it through the press. So I did not go to the press to say, well, there is this issue and we need the employers to comment on it, or there's this issue and we need the workers to comment on it. We don't do our business like that. We see ourselves as the servants of the people to do a professional job. So we're not discussing the bill. We're not consulting with our partners in the public domain. Now, with respect to allaying the fears, I was not in the meeting. I have not had a brief on what took place in the meeting, and I'm not sure that I'm equipped to tell you that the fears expressed at the meeting that I believe you're referring to, I don't know what those fears are. What I can tell you is that with respect to the bill itself, it is a framework piece of legislation. It does not set any rates. It does not set, well, it sets some conditions. But the conditions that it sets, and this is really one of the amazing things, you will read the bill. I'm sure you will. The only conditions that have been set are pieces of labor legislation that already exist. The only thing that the framework bill says you must adhere to are things like the Employment Rights Act, the Employment of Women Maternity Leave Act, holiday with pay. Now, if you were telling me, I don't know if you were at the meeting or if you got any inside information, but if you were telling me that the employers are upset with having to obey and to comply with those pieces of legislation, then I'd like to know so that we can sit now again as a cabinet to say, well, we're not on a slippery slope, but we're at the bottom. Because those are the only conditions that are in the bill. They are in a schedule to the bill, and they list already existing pieces of legislation. So I don't know what the fears are. I've already told you about the provisions for appeal, and we believe that we have covered all the bases where those are concerned. We've the third schedule of the bill, Employment Rights Act, just for completeness, Employment Rights Act, Employment Prevention of Discrimination Act, Employment Sexual Harassment Prevention Act, Labor Clauses Public Contracts Act, Labor Department Act, Protection of Wages Act, Safety and Health at Work Act, and the Shops Act. These are all pieces of legislation that you already know. All businesses need to abide by these. But remember that in setting rates and other conditions, there has to be discussion. So there's not going to be any consultation over whether or not these 8 pieces of legislation are to be complied with. There's not going to be any consultation with respect to these 8 pieces of legislation that are to be complied with. There are pieces of legislation that are to be complied with. There's discussion because we have to modernize legislation, but not fundamentally about whether or not these are optional or not.
Going to see debate in Parliament?
We debate this bill on Tuesday.
And then, how soon are you likely to begin the consultations as it relates to the rates?
Once the bill is passed, we will start the consultation. With the intention is to begin with the hotel sector, and that comes out of meetings that began in September of last year, where we were seeking to establish some minimum for the treatment of workers in hotel establishments, a minimum level. We were not debating a collective agreement. It was a minimum standard in a few areas. Those discussions, initially led by the Prime Minister, then led by Minister Ganesh and myself, took place right up until a couple of days before Christmas last year. And we agreed some areas, but we did not agree a final document. So it is our view that we need to make some progress where that is concerned, to continue that consultation to establish some minimum. That discussion in terms of establishing a minimum, a floor, started in September and went right through to December.
I wanted to go back to the constellation thoughts that you were having. You outlined the scenario regarding the construction sector and so on, with the workers not being treated as subcontractors and so on. How big a problem is that, not only in the construction sector, but overall within labor?
I can't give you numbers. I know it is a huge problem in construction because you'll go on a site and there'll be maybe 150 people, and the chief labor officer will ask about the employees and we'll get a list of 20 or 30. It is a huge problem in construction because construction hires large numbers of persons for projects. The other large employers would be the same tourism sector, but we don't see as big an issue, anything close to construction. We don't see any tourism sector because there's been a culture of you employ people. What we had in tourism were people being employed on 3-month contracts and 6-month contracts. But season has always been part of because the industry is seasonal. But we went past seasonal, unfortunately, to having these 3-month contracts where people can't get, one lady said she and her husband is a guard, a watchman, but she can't, together because of the temporary nature of the contract, can't buy a TV stand on hire purchase because the hire purchase company not accepting this 3-month contract. I mean, you can't go anywhere and get any, unless you plan to pay back in 3 months. You can't get anything. You can't do anything with the 3-month contract. And if you're gonna pay back in 3 months, you gotta go right at the beginning of the contract. So these are some of these that are happening in Barbados, and I feel absolutely certain that the workers of this country understand what is happening and appreciate what government is doing on their behalf. And I give to them my word that we will make sure that nothing derails our work to make sure that the workers in this country are able to at least have a decent standard of living.
Dignity.
Yeah, they have to live in dignity. They're human beings.
In terms of adherence to the labor laws in existence, we already have the Employment Rights Tribunal, which adjudicates in these matters. Now, based on this concessions clause, the Minister of Labor, your office, would be the the adjudicator, based on my understanding of it.
The Employment Rights Tribunal, you need to separate them because there's no political interference. So when you say the ministry, my office, if you say that, generally speaking, people assume a certain level of authority for the minister, right? This is a tribunal which has representation from government, employers, and workers.
Okay, understood.
But it is within the ambit of the ministry responsible for labor.
Right. So the question remains: why the redundancy then? Why not just put it under the Employment Rights Tribunal to determine whether these measures have been adhered to?
To determine whether
These measures, because the system already exists under the Employment Rights Tribunal too.
well, for certain matters, the investigation will happen by labor officers. Once there's a report that there is some non-adherence, labor officers do what labor officers do. And what labor officers do is to investigate and then report back. The Office of the Chief Labor Officer will then relate to the ministry that grants the concessions. Remember that in this situation, there's a ministry responsible for granting concessions. It might be finance, it might be tourism, it might be agriculture, it might be industry. There are concessions in various are given by various ministries. That's where it has to go. Now, given that we're talking about revenue foregone, we believe that to appeal having concessions suspended or revoked, the body to go to is not back to the Employment Rights Tribunal because it is now no longer simply a labor relations matter. This is an appeal at the level of having your concessions revoked or suspended. The Revenue Authority's appeals should come into place there. The Employment Rights Tribunal will deal with if there is a dispute on the setting of wages and conditions of work. So there's a consultation, we publish, and an employer believes, no, you should not have included safety shoes in that minimum, that the company is supervised safety shoes. There's going to be dialogue, and if there's no agreement, then the employer can appeal. Then it would be for the Employment Rights Tribunal. When you see the bill, you will see the very last schedule has what are called consequential amendments. And one of those then expands the remit of the Employment Rights Tribunal to hear that particular dispute, or whether or not these should be the minimum rates, or whether these should be the minimum conditions of work.
Okay. I want to thank everybody. I want to thank Minister Jordan because he's supposed to be somewhere completely different right now. So
The secretary was escorting.
I want to thank him for sticking this one all the way through and answering all the questions. I'm sure that you'll have well enough to take you through to the whole of next week. So thank you all.
Thank you.